microphone?
Better.
Yeah, that's something like this.
Yeah.
It's better right now. All right. Well, good morning and welcome to Antwerp. What I would like to do in the next half hour, 45 minutes is do, on the basis of an actually very simple range of data, raise, or at least extract from them a number of highly difficult theoretical and methodological issues. The empirical material that I would, or at least the analysis that I will show is actually very straightforward. So you will see there's nothing sophisticated about the analysis, it's just about looking at certain things and then following them up. All right. But what I would like to highlight is the impact it has in raising a number of issues. The central issue for myself is who is the subject in linguistic landscape analysis. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with linguistic landscape analysis, but it's like a relatively new branch of social linguistics in which we look at the landscape. So in other words, emplaced language in space, all right? And it's really booming. Yes? So this is a new form of analysis, a new form of looking at notably multilingualism, social linguistic diversity, but also populations. And one of the frustrations I have with most of mainstream linguistic landscape analysis is that it makes a number of assumptions that I find a little bit under-theorized, and I will highlight a few in just a moment. But here's, at least for me, here is the point. Who is the subject? Okay, so who are the real people in linguistic landscape analysis? Okay, but in trying to answer that question, I will have to go through several others, and here's where the story becomes relatively heavy-handed. I'm going to use two angles, of course, the angle of superdiversity, but superdiversity here as a theoretical repertoire, okay, as an approach to social linguistic reality. And then a little bit more specific thing that I will also use as an angle is a thing we now call ELA. I have my own acronym, ELA. And ELA stands for Ethnographic Linguistic Landscape Analysis. Ethnographic Linguistic Landscape Analysis. So within this booming world of linguistic landscape work, ELA has a little segment there, that's represented. But those are essentially the two angles that I will use. And I will use them on my own neighborhood, on Bergen. Not too far from here. If you walk, it would take you like half an hour. And you really would see a lot of superdiversity on your way in as well as out. And in that sense, what I would like to do is to start from older work. It's the book you see here. It's I think 4 or 5 years old now. And it's a very, very, very little book on that neighborhood, on my own neighborhood. But I would like to walk you along the road that I've traveled since. So over the past, say, 4 or 5 years, a number of new issues have emerged or have become inevitable as research issues, and I'm going to try to address those. Okay. Now, speaking about linguistic landscaping, now here, of course, I don't do justice to the more sophisticated work, but there's a lot of work, in which you see these particular range of assumptions that I find problematic. Okay. One of the things that we see very, very frequently in linguistic landscape analysis is it is about space, and space is imagined on the basis of a map. For instance, we do research on multilingualism in the area of the central railway station in Rome, okay? Or we do it in a big shopping street in Singapore. So you have the shopping street, and essentially that is the unit. So space is usually in a very simple way arranged, identified, and also demarcated as the zone of research. No trouble with that, that's absolutely fine. It's a choice you make. But the next thing is a little bit more problematic. So there is a jump, in my view, from space to language, because we're investigating language in that space, and automatically to community. All right, and here is, I think, a highly problematic issue. Okay? There's a very simple assumption. So we see in a space, imagine the shopping street in Singapore, we see 8 languages, right? We see Mandarin Chinese, we see Indonesian or Malay, we we see German, we see English, we see Norwegian, right? The assumption is that within that space, there would be individuals who use that language. It's, of course you will say, sure, how else? Yeah. So in itself, this is a very, very plausible sort of assumption, but I will make it a little bit more complicated in the sense that you also, whenever you make that jump from language to space to community, you always need to ask one or two extra questions. So this is, I think, a weak point. Then a third relatively general feature of linguistic landscape studies is strong preferences for urban areas. Okay, so the big cities, where normally you would encounter most linguistic diversity, most languages, let's say, okay? But then again, you know, what is the urban? What is urban? Again, we have to go to the definition of space, all right? So on the map, we see that there's a very big space, which is called Singapore. It has 5 million inhabitants, and as a consequence, it is urban. So here again, the notion of the urban is in many ways non-theorized, okay, or under-theorized, or very often also intuitive. Okay, so sort of general, intuitive identification of this is an urban space because officially it's called a city. Many, many people live there. And so here's the problem now. One of the things you see is that the subject, okay, is actually inferred from it. We don't actually look at the subject. The subjects are inferred from the analysis. I don't know how widely you have been reading linguistic landscape analysis, but one of the features you very often see is images, okay, of language in space, but there are no people in it, right? No people. It's just like a shop front, right, with an inscription, but there are no people in it. And so they are inferred from it. We assume a number of things about the individuals who use that space, who use these languages, and so on. And again, I want to make that relatively more, how should I say that, a little bit more substantial, right? So we need to add a number of extra questions here in order to be accurate. I'm going to use ELA, so ethnographic linguistic landscape analysis, and just a very quick run through what we mean by that. Well, essentially what it means is we combine longitudinal fieldwork, so not just walking in and out of a place, but remaining in a place, all right, with an ethnographic viewpoint. And again, ethnography here is a theoretical repertoire. Okay. In my case, so for instance, the work that I've done on my own neighborhood, of course, is longitudinal in the sense that I've been there for approximately 25 years. And really as not just an observer, but also as a member of the community, as somebody involved in the community, somebody also to some extent building the community, building the neighborhood, and so on. Okay? So longitudinal fieldwork, and then we add to that a number of ethnographic assumptions. So one of the assumptions is whenever we see language displayed in space, it is always a trace of social action. Now do keep that notion in mind because it's going to define everything what follows. Social action. Social action, if you go back to certain traditions of say, social theoretical scholarship in the 20th century, always means interaction. So any form of social action would be an interaction with other people. So whenever we see language, for instance, Norwegian in Singapore, the first question or an assumption we have to make is, this interacts, or at least it is a trace of interaction, all right? And what sort of interaction exactly has been going on the basis of this little bit of language that we see? What is it made for? What does it originate from? Okay, so where does it come from? Which interactions, all right? And which interactions does it, in a way, structure or lead to, and so on and so on. So that's the first assumption, the ethnographic assumption that we always use. The second one is, longitudinal fieldwork means that we zoom in on change rather than on a snapshot. There's a big problem with snapshot analysis. Like in my neighborhood, all right? Whenever you think you have it in my neighborhood, so whenever you think I've done all the work, all the field work in my neighborhood, and now I have the absolutely clear image of the neighborhood, by the time you write it down in an article, it's changed. And so little book I showed you is now 5-6 years old. I think there are something like 20 illustrations in the book. Only one is there right now, okay? And so we have to try to explain the rapid dynamics of change in a human area, in a zone, which is also the unit of say, social action. That's what we need to explain, because very often the snapshot analysis misleads us. So it also suggests a degree of stability, which essentially, and with essentially I mean in its essence, right, is never there, right? Now, of course, that last little thing, well, in many ways is the definition of superdiversity as a social linguistic approach. So the idea that we don't assume stability, we assume a highly unstable system, a highly dynamic system, and a thing that's never really ready, okay? So whenever we try to think about a social environment, of course, we initially will look for stability. We call that structure, and I will return to that later as well. But when we do superdiversity research, we always have to keep in mind, that things are unstable, that they're changing all the time, and in other words, that the structural itself may be change. And so what is the structure in an environment like mine? It may not be stability, it may be the exact opposite of stability, it may be change. So structure may be the absence of stability, right? Now, one final little remark. I already said that in mainstream linguistic landscape analysis, the subject is inferred. Well, here, it becomes visible after the actions. And so in other words, we zoom into action, like interaction, right? And it's only after that the subject emerges. It's hard to explain right now because I can only do it in a sort of general theoretical way, but I'm sure that the moment I show you a number of materials, then it will become clear. Very final observation. In the literature about superdiversity, very often superdiversity research is narrowed down to a demographic thing, like an increase of nationalities in an area. Rotterdam in 1979 had 43 nationalities. Now they're over 180. So many people would see superdiversity along these lines. Now for us, yes, of course, that is one of the dimensions, but we very often overlook another dimension that is even more, how should I say, more, or at least the impact of it is even larger, and that's the new connection between offline and online life worlds. Certainly from the viewpoint of language, there is no human or social activity imaginable these days in which the online is not in some way involved. So even if we're strictly offline, like right now, all of you have an online machine in your pockets, right? And my wife is using it right now. Now that means, she might be live broadcasting. I have no idea what she's doing, but she might be live broadcasting on Facebook right now. And there might be individuals in South Africa also observing what is happening here. Okay, so this is the new world in which we live. It's a super diverse world. It's a very important, big dimension of super diversity. And in the examples that I will show and analyze, you will see that it's actually the interaction of these two. New migrations, new populations, okay, but also online and offline. And of course, a new, or at least a very big range of new issues will emerge. So this is the general background. Now what I would like to do is, so I return to my neighborhood. Well, I never have to return to my neighborhood, I'm always there, but I return to the work that I have been doing earlier in my neighborhood. And I'm going to focus on a thing that has become really inevitable over the last number of years, in the sense that it stares you in the face, right? The things are invisible lines. Here's another thing about linguistic landscape analysis. You can only observe what is observable. Okay, so we will very strongly look at the things that are really there within that neighborhood, okay? Now here is the main assumption due to the online-offline nexus, all right? From my neighborhood there are lots of invisible lines, okay? And what I would like to do is I'm going to follow a number of these invisible lines running in and out of my neighborhood, all right? Knowing that it raises a number of issues about what is the city, right? Like a geographical space, and who is the population. Okay, so it's a very, very clear sort of argument, empirically, but that's not, or at least, you know, my main concern is the big issues that follow from it. Like, how do we imagine the city? All right, here we go. I will focus in what follows on a feature of my neighborhood that is, I mean, I've written about it as well on a number of occasions, churches. One of the really very, very big, how should I say, businesses in my neighborhood is God. God is really, really selling very, very well. In my street, you know, there's 11, 12, 13, 14, so whenever I walk around, I always count them, religious places, most of them of this particular type. So new forms of let's say, mostly, no, I have to start elsewhere. New forms of radical Christianity, okay, that very often work on an American model of that particular type of Christianity, long sessions of prayer and of worshiping, okay, that are heavily animated. There's music, there's dance, there's food, you know, there's also very individual in the sense, you know, that you have to confess, you have to speak, and so on. And there's also healing going on. There's also, I mean, all sorts of things that a number of us would consider to be really weird going on. Most of these churches have their origins in migration. So one of the things you see here is a church that's been in our neighborhood for a while, the Mountain of Fire and Miracles, and these guys are based in Lagos, Nigeria. Right. So it is on the material that, let's say, traditionally we would include in linguistic landscaping. Now, whenever I would do ordinary linguistic landscaping, the only conclusion I would draw from here is, oh, this is English. Okay, but it's English from Nigeria. And Nigeria itself has approximately 500 languages. Okay, so we know that English itself doesn't really inform us a lot because it may hide 500 languages. And so here is one thing. Maybe we should start thinking about Nigeria rather than Antwerp, okay? But one of the things we see here is in my street, literally around my corner, there is a locus, a location that is deeply connected with this one, Yaba in Lagos, a particular neighborhood in Lagos, right? And here's an invisible line. So we see an invisible line running from Antwerp to Lagos. Already, okay, I will make this a thicker and thicker plot, but start thinking about these huge questions, all right? What is the urban, what is Antwerp, and who is involved in activities in my neighborhood, right? So who's the population and what is the space? So here we see an invisible line. Okay, that's one example. 100 meters to the right, there's another church, also from Nigeria. Now these churches, they are, of course, you know, locally there, they're emplaced. Usually they use abandoned shops, so shops that have basically discontinued doing what they used to do. Those are big spaces, relatively cheap, and they move in. Okay, so here is a big one, and they are very active. Like if we would go there now, there would be like 300 people involved in all sorts of activities, mostly say Bible study, prayer, but also children's animation and so on. It is really there. However, all of them are also very active online. Okay, and so here again, it would be English, sure, but Nigerian English, we've already identified the difficulties with that notion. But let's look at details. And one of the details is this. Oh my God, it's a website address. So linguistic landscape analysis, let's open the website. What do we see on the website is this. Or at least you know this is just one example. So you see how individuals, members of the congregation, share their experiences, usually spiritual experiences, you know, with the rest of the congregation on this website. Now if you read this one here, and I would like to invite you to do so, you see, so here is an individual who's located in Manchester, England. All right? One of the things we learn here is, so what she writes is, I listen or I view your activities at night and they really help me. So one of the things we see is that what happens in my street is indeed broadcasted, okay? And we see another invisible line. We already had one in the direction of Nigeria. Now we see an invisible line. In a sense, there is a community, or at least an individual, elsewhere who also participates in an activity in my street. And she's in Manchester. Okay, let's move on. Another example, again, literally around the corner, another church, Mission Évangélique de la Colombe de la Vérité. These guys are from Kinshasa, okay, in Central Africa. So, invisible line from Antwerp to Kinshasa. We already had one to Lagos, we already had one to Manchester. Just keep those in mind. Okay. It's an interesting window because right next to the general banner of the street, these days we have this. So I made this image the day before yesterday. Which language do you identify here? Or languages? French, yes. Hmm? Yeah. Portuguese. Portuguese. So this is a young man, okay, who makes music and he's made a record. The record is religious music, and interestingly, you know, the theme of the record is a book that belongs to the Mormon religion. Okay, so again we are branching out into a world of diversity here, but of a very different order. And so this is connected to Mormonism. Okay. Now again, let's look at details. You've already spotted it. Oh, hey, hang on. What is this here? So our good friend Jacinto is on Facebook and on Instagram. So let's have a look at Facebook and see what we can learn from that. So what we learn from his Facebook is that he has been in Spain. He has acquired a degree in Spain, but he's born in Luanda, in Angola. Now one of the things we very often see is that in churches from any, well, let's say from any place in Central Africa, that French would be the main vernacular, but it would be very open to Portuguese. One of the reasons that we know that for a while already is that many people who claim to be from, for instance, the Congo and are refugees are originally from Angola. But Angola, or at least if you're from Angola, it's very, very difficult to become recognized refugee here in this country. Okay. But here we see that. So he's from Luanda, he operates within a church which is from another place, okay, and he himself has a trajectory of migration that includes Madrid, right, Spain. Okay? So invisible lines again becomes slightly more complicated from Luanda to Kinshasa, Kinshasa to Berchem, and then there's this line to Madrid. So invisible lines. Now here, of course, we see real involvement in activities. So this man is really also active in my street, but what he brings in is all sorts of resources from other places. So the material that he sweeps up, of course, you know, he also brings in into the activities in my street. Now, there's not a church. A little bit further, it used to be a Chinese restaurant. Now it's a street, and the language there would be Spanish. Now we've done a little bit of research with these people. I think three years ago, a student of mine worked there for a while. And one of the things we know is that they're connected to Latin America. They have their origins in Lima, Peru. Okay, so an invisible line. We already have these. In fact, more. But they are grounded in Lima. once again, let's look at details, all right? They're also very active online. They're active all over the world. It's a very, very big network. And the link between all the nodes in that network, for instance, in the Philippines, they're very active there. They're also very active in I think, Taiwan. The link between all these nodes is the thing you see here. Bethel TV. What is Bethel TV? Well, let's go online and have a look. This is Bethel TV. It's American. It's one of these very, very big American media churches. It's a very big enterprise, even in the sense, you know, that you can, so you can have an account and you can get the premium free for 7 days if you register now. So they really behave like a transnational company, like you know, Microsoft or Google or whatever. You get the premium free. Now, they're very, very active online as well, in the sense of on Google. They've got a huge Google channel, 149,000 people following on YouTube. Okay, and we know from just Googling that they are based in Redding, California. Right. So, invisible network in my street. Okay, we have these guys who are from Lima, or at least based in Lima. Most of the congregation would also be drawn from Latin America in this particular church, but they are networked to a place here, right? So more invisible lines. So once again, what is Antwerp, right? What is the urban environment, and who is the population? We begin to see it dissipates into all sorts of areas. Another church, a very recent one, it just opened a few months ago. Again, the origin is in Nigeria. Here I think Abuja, so not Lagos, but Abuja in Nigeria. And we see the preacher is called Johnson Suleiman. Interesting name, because you know, Suleiman of course would identify him as a Muslim. So he must be from, say, from the north. Anyway, he's very successful and he's very, very active. For instance, he's very, very active on YouTube. Many of the services, you know, that he has performed, and these would include also the in a way, confessions. I've been a sinner, but then I discovered God. I spoke to the priest, and so to Johnson. I spoke to him, and he made me realize that my life needed a completely different direction. And so here I am, and now I'm happy. I have a husband, I have a child, I have a job. I'm doing well. So very, very active online on YouTube. So he's active in my street, okay, but also active online, right? And he travels. So he also really, in the real world, you know, he also travels. So he has an agenda on his website, a very interesting, a very beautiful, you know, website here, in which he announces all sorts of activities. And here we see Switzerland, but also another place in North America. So he's really all over the world. And so he's a global, or at least a globally active preacher, right? So now we begin to realize that the outlet in my street is just one of the shops he has. So this is an international network. Okay. Now, again, let's look at details. A very, very good website. Of course, he's on all the social media. You can follow him there. And again, he's got a large number of active followers. But he also, on his website, he gives us a verse of the day, a verse from the Bible, a verse of the day. Or at least he offers it, but it's not really offered by him. Okay? So he has another agent, another actor moving in. And the actor is Biblica. Now whenever you Google Biblica, you get this, the Bible Gateway. And this is huge. This is really, really very, 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 very big. Now, who's the Bible Gateway? It's a transnational incorporated say actor, and they are based in Michigan, in the United States. And they provide all sorts of Bible-related resources, trainings, but also just availability of materials, including these little snippets, the verse of the day, and so on. And they do that all over the world. Right. Now, again, an invisible line, right, that runs from Lagos to here, then he moves here, he's been in Switzerland, he's been in Switzerland in the meantime, and all of that concentrates, or at least has a locus in my street. So, what is my street? What is the urban? Who is the population? One city. There's a lot more to be discussed, of course, in the way of examples, but if I make a very, very quick roundup of what my neighborhood actually is, when we start looking at these invisible lines, it's something like that. And it's not exhaustive. So this is just off the top of my head, things that I either investigated or just, for instance, there's an invisible line, and a very, very strong one, with Sri Lanka. At the end of my street, there is a very little grocery shop which is run by a husband and a wife who are from Sri Lanka. And she is on the phone the whole day, right? So whenever you walk into that street, you hear their language all the time. She's online with her family over there all the time. And so when her family goes to bed in Sri Lanka, right, which is around 6 in the afternoon, she makes a switch to regional TV over there, right? So you would always hear languages, but also information, material, sports, from over there. So this is also in my street. Whenever I walk into that shop, I don't just hear or use Dutch, okay? And of course, there would be other people using Spanish or English, in a number of cases, a little bit of Russian even, all right? I always hear a language, right? It's always there. So it is also in my street. Let's make a little summary of this. What goes on? So whenever you try to understand social action in my street, which is a real neighborhood, really material, a real material neighborhood, okay? But what goes on? What we see is, of course, globally networked practices. Nothing new about it. We are highly educated, and also we produce them all the time ourselves. But it also involves actors and audiences, so communities as well as individuals, who are not there, or not only there. So a number of the actions that I can observe in my neighborhood can only be understood by looking at actors elsewhere. What is being aware of the influence of actors elsewhere. And these activities, they, in a way, if you want to understand, or at least if you want to be precise analytically, the only thing that my neighborhood has to offer is a moment of actualization, of localization, if you wish. So there's infrastructure in my neighborhood, like the churches, okay? And for a while, like for an hour, for an afternoon, they are an active node in a networked range of activity that is, of course, global, or at least, highly transnational. The localization, however, is never purely local. What we see in the churches, of course, is the localization of global practices, right? And a lot of the meaning of what goes on in the eyes of the audiences in the churches, for instance, a lot of that meaning has to do with exactly the fact that it's not local at all, that they are connected to audiences in Africa, in Latin America, in the United States, all over the world, right? So in other words, it's not a detail. It's very, very important in understanding what goes on. Okay? So the idea, okay, here in this particular church there's only 40 people or 120 people, but in reality, we are a member of a huge community, that has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of followers. Okay? So that's a very, very strong sort of incentive to get into those communities and also enjoy what is going on there. Right? But what goes on? This is no longer linguistic landscaping. This is ethnography. Okay? So we have to move out of there in order to find answers to a number of huge questions. And of course, one of these huge questions was, what is the urban? And so we already know that what goes on there is global practices involving non-local actors and audiences, okay? But so what is the urban? Now, in reality, space, like my street, my neighborhood, is just a locus for a moment of activities, of these global activities. So what my my neighborhood is, at any moment, is a nexus of global activities that has a little place there for a while, okay, for a little while, like an hour, an afternoon, even a very brief encounter, and so on and so on. My neighborhood has infrastructures for that. So one of the things that we have in my neighborhood is exactly a very strong Wi-Fi infrastructure, and it's not the only place, I mean, it's absolutely general, but we need to keep it in mind, because these invisible lines need an invisible infrastructure, an infrastructure that is not inscribed in the linguistic landscape. Or at least, yes it is, but in the small print, right? That's why you need to follow the Facebook logos, that's why you need to click on the Google addresses and so on. So we need to be aware of the fact that the urban is not just a material infrastructure in the traditional sense. Lots of buildings together with roads and streets and shops and all sorts of things in between. No, it's a lot more than that. So there is another infrastructure, an overlay in the city, okay, that creates an entirely different level of activity, of social activity. And then here is the problem. We know that these activities are connected across the world. That also means, that the city can be active in a village, right? And that urban stuff may be a very strong feature of village life, and vice versa. So here again are say traditional understandings of what the city and the urban is. Well, we need to slightly qualify it because it is not just what happens in the city, like in Antwerp. No. A lot of the stuff that happens in Antwerp can only be understood by understanding, for instance, a rural area in Sri Lanka. Okay? That explains it. It's not the nature of Antwerp, the city of Antwerp, the demography of Antwerp, and so on. So here we have super diverse groups, also in the sense of online groups. Not just the fragmentation of nationalities, or religious, ethnic, social-linguistic, etc., but also online. So this is another dimension of language. And here's the final question: who's the subject? So this was the issue that I raised at the very beginning. Well, who's the subject of activities in my street, right, in Antwerp? Well, all and everyone who are involved in these network practices. Is not just those individuals who are really, let's say, materially there in my street, okay? It's lots more, and all of them are active, are involved, shape the social life in my neighborhood, in my street. And here theoretically, but I mean, I could give a lecture on this particular phrase alone. They are linked, all right, and they are made into a community by activity, right? So in other words, not by features of a population, but by features of an activity, like a religious activity. Who connects the audiences in the Philippines, what connects the audiences in the Philippines and in the United States and in Latin America with those who are active in my street? It's an activity, it's religion, right? It is not an identity of being from Lima, Peru, or from the Philippines. No, it's an activity, right? And so here you see how the individuals emerge from activities, all right? So we look at activity, and one of the results of zooming into activities is that we get a completely different idea of who is actually involved in these activities. So that leads to an agenda. We need to rethink groups, populations, in the context of on and offline super diversity. Many of our older notions and ideas that we have about groups and what it is to be a group, and identities of groups, and so on and so on, and of course our own identities as individuals, they're on shaky grounds. We are very, very rapid in making generalizations, extrapolations, and assumptions, that empirically run into trouble as soon as you start looking at these new dimensions, and so on. So in general, when we look at like any social environment, we very often have the inclination, also theoretically elaborate, the entire 20th century contributed to that assumption, but an assumption that we have to look at groups Okay? So the first step is, who are they? And then we shall look at activity. Well, here, I'm afraid we need to basically reverse the order. We start from activities, and then look at who is really, in a way, let's say, an actor in the activity. In the beginning, I announced, or I basically said that I would start from old work and move with you to more recent work. Well, those issues here are the stuff that I wrote here in a relatively new time. And just one very, very final thing, okay? When we think of structure, it's also a thing that I said in the beginning. Structure meaning stability, okay? Well, in the case of linguistic landscape, but also a lot of anthropology, a lot of other types of research, in reality, the structure or the structural in analysis used to be the existing population, right? Those who are here, like the 180 nationalities in Rotterdam. That's the structure. And from structure, we would like to, or at least, we were used to begin to analyze, the activities within that structure. Now here, of course, I'm afraid again that that's not enough. Whenever you take these existing communities for granted, it doesn't really, how should I say, it doesn't really answer a lot. You need to look at local and non-local things, okay? You also need to look at things that are enduring, they're always there, or at least they're there for a while. And also things that happen, right? Like, live broadcasting of a religious activity from my street all the way to Manchester, right? And then it becomes incorporated in the life in my street. Okay, so you need to look at those different things, and a word that I suggested for it, but throw it away the moment you've heard it, because the word is just a word. Let's try to avoid the structural and look at another thing, the constructural, which is a mixture of enduring features and non-enduring features, a mixture of relative stability and highly dynamic change, okay? A mixture of what is there and a mixture of what is not really there, but might be involved in activities there. And so here again is, it's a very small, I only write very, very small books, okay? So this is not a very, very small book. And most of the rest is right there. Thank you very much.